Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. So we only have a few minutes, so I'm only going to show two slides, or maybe three. And basically, before I look at the specific regulatory policy for South Africa, I'm going to give a couple of examples or some lessons that we've learned from other environments. South Africa is not the first to be looking for full broadband policies, for full distribution of their broadband, for national broadband strategies. So it's not the first, so we can learn a number of things from others. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about those, and then I'll talk to the policy specifically. And you'll see that there's much to be learned from outside. So the first thing that we talk to is the policy is really addressing the non-commercially viable parts of broadband. Obviously, the commercially viable stuff is all that's competition between different operators. But where the policy addresses particularly is essentially the non-commercially viable areas. And what we believe absolutely is to make this thing work, collaboration is important. We really don't think that in the last mile especially, a whole bunch of operators going to build this broadband network or broadband access is viable. And a few examples we've seen. So for example, Mike mentioned the Kenya case where a bunch of operators are getting together. So we've done all the business modeling for that scenario, and there's substantial benefit by operators getting together and building a common access network for that last mile. And I'll give one specific example from Mexico. Mexico is also looking at a national broadband policy. In their case, they are looking at 3 parties building the last mile wireless access. And the business model that we've done for them shows that the return on investment is 6 times better by building one network between 3 parties than three parties building their own network. So there's a very strong case for collaboration in the cases where there's reduced viability. The collaboration environment increases the commercial viability of the projects very substantially. So there's 3 areas that we look at when we talk to those sharing collaboration environments. So first you need aligned leadership. So you have to get the multiple parties together into a common plan. Now if you look at our policy and you see how many people are involved in it, there are tens and tens of people that are involved in it. So it's going to be extremely difficult to get something to work when you have 12 government departments, all of those kind of things. It's one of the big issues that we have with the policy is if you want this thing to work, national broadband, there has to be strong coordinate single leadership of this thing. It's not going to work with 12 departments, 3 organizations, local, national, all of these people pulling in different directions. The second element is that we speak to is that when we see collaborations typically happening, one of the problems that we see is each of the parties builds their own business case and takes into account their own risks. But what actually happens is they are very often taking into account the same risks and applying some protection factor for those risks. So the business case still doesn't work even with collaboration unless you collaborate in such a way that you can actually stack up your risks in one place and build a business case that takes into account the risks only once. But if all parties that collaborate take into account the risks, it still makes it difficult for that business case to work. And the third element is, and others have spoken to it, reduced uncertainty changes the economics. If investors have uncertainty in what's going to happen, the economics, they will always profile extra risk into the business case, and that's enough to kill many business cases, the uncertainty in that. The second area I want to talk about is the main risks that we see, and basically we're saying if these risks are not addressed, a national broadband policy becomes very difficult for investors to buy into. So there's 4 areas that we speak to essentially is the market. So we believe that investors will not invest until you have a stable, defined and regulated market. People are, and we've seen cases, for example, in Wales, where there's been a first round of policy, a first round of objectives, a first kind of set of speed and dates, a bunch of people agreeing to participate, and then those rules being changed, the bandwidth being changed, and the investors that were going to invest all pull out of it because they don't have the confidence that the regulatory will be stable. So the 3 elements to that is basically we believe it's very important that there is really the ambition set out. Now the policy doesn't address that right now. We assume that will come out in the strategy, that there will be clear speeds, dates, times, what actually is this thing going to be, what is the objective. If those objectives are not clear, then investors, especially the private investors, will not buy into the program. You need the wholesale and the retail entities need to be, the clarity needs to be, the regulatory environment between wholesale and retail needs to be clear, and regulation itself needs to be clear. Now, in terms of the ambitions, we really believe from a policy point of view, the South African policy needs to move beyond where it is today. It's still relatively low bandwidth, and set a kind of a leapfrog objective, because it's going to take a couple of years to deploy it. If we start with what's broadband today, I think we're going to miss the boat. We really need to be starting with what's broadband in 5 years' time, because in 3 years' time, then we'll already be there. The second is around technology. We absolutely believe that the broadband in South Africa is going to be a combination of fiber and wireless. We don't think the last mile portion is going to be completely fiber. Obviously fiber will be a strong part of it, but we absolutely believe that wireless will still be a strong part of it, but that's only going to work once the low spectrum eventually becomes available. But we also see the technology is not a single shot. It's very much business case driven, and it's iterative. As we've done these models with different people, we see that you start with one scenario, but actually as you build a business case, your technology choice evolves. So you have to work through that thing on an iterative basis. We don't believe in just taking a single shot at the technology. It does require the business case, but it has to be future-proof, and there also has to be an exit strategy. And that might sound strange to have exit strategies. What we are seeing is non-telco investors coming into these programs. So people like civil works companies, people who understand long-term investment strategy, they are prepared to put money into the system, but they are not primarily telcos. So they don't want to be in it permanently. So we're seeing those kind of people coming into the industry, but they want to have, as part of the business case, they want to have a clear exit strategy in the business case. How are they actually going to get out of it and get their money out at the same time? The third thing is construction and commit to use. And that is pre-commitment for asset utilization. So we also believe that especially in the last mile, the build it and they will come model absolutely doesn't work. The business case just doesn't work. You have to have some kind of pre-commitment for that asset utilization. Now, the policy document does specifically address that in terms of committing government institutions and government revenue. So that is a good start, but it absolutely has to be firmed up and finalized. If that's not concretely signed off on, then this kind of bulk investment isn't going to happen. And the third part of that is aggregated demand, and that's the same sort of thing. If you have a shared access, you are able to aggregate the demand, and you're able to share that demand amongst the physical infrastructure, and that gives you enough of a business case to make the thing work. So commit to use. And the last item is mobilization and a top sponsor. We believe that a project like this, a national broadband project, in any country only works when there are clear, simple leadership lines. So it doesn't work with 20 people in a room trying to make all this stuff work, and it just doesn't work like that. There have to be a couple of people, what we call a small group of owners, who can really drive this thing, and eventually it becomes one single person as a sponsor for the thing to make it work. If you have all private sector and all government sector all together, it just isn't going to work. There have to be clear sponsorship guidelines for that. So that's broadly some experience that we've had from other markets. So basically regulatory, technology, construction, and sponsorship. I'm just going to talk very quickly to the 4 questions that Juanita actually asked us. What does it actually mean for South Africans? And obviously the policy document is just that. It's a policy document. It's not yet a deployable document. So Richard has spoken to the advantages of what the policy, the national broadband will give. But obviously it needs the strategy and it needs the implementation plan. But for us, it will only become meaningful when the risks that we've identified are dealt with. And in particular, that there's a clear sponsorship, real individuals identified as sponsors. We don't believe in departmental sponsorship. 4 departments in SIP 15 doesn't make a broadband policy work. It has to be eventually identified as individuals. In terms of impact on local government, so the policy kind of quite strongly diminishes the role of local government in this to a very minimum role. Now, our view is that local governments shouldn't all go and build their own strategy and their own architectures. We do believe that it's correct that local governments should fit within the overall policy, and build structures that fit with that, because if you have everybody designing something completely different, it's impossible for this thing to really work. And from a vendor community point of view, you want to have consistency in process, in the way that the procurement methodology is done, the architecture, and I think that will be a lot more efficient. That doesn't mean that they shouldn't go and build those things. They should do them in their own time, but they definitely, we believe, should fit within the wider scheme of things. What is the role of the private sector? So in the policy document, the private sector is kind of a little bit pushed aside, especially on the backbone side of it, and essentially it's more left into the last mile part. And there we do believe that the private sector can very much get involved, but they need to get involved on a collaborative basis. We absolutely don't believe that the last mile of this thing will work by individual people building their own networks separately. And that's not just wireless, that's fiber also. We believe absolutely the business case for fiber deployments increases substantially when it's done in collaboration. And from an implementation point of view, so that's a tricky question, but we believe implementation will only happen when we get to this, we see a kind of focused groups, very specific objectives, and very specific sponsorship in it. So it might be split into a couple of blocks. I don't think it's going to happen all in one shot, in one big monster thing. I think it will need to be split into a couple of blocks, but it will only work if we have real clear sponsorship of each of those primary blocks. So I'm going to stop there. I think we're way over time, and I don't know if there's questions on that.
Thanks. Tim, I just want to talk about the process of developing a policy or implementation plan with your wider experience in Mexico, South America, and so forth. I'm sure you know. One thing that I think is that the consultation is far more important even than the end result. You need broad consultation. If you take Colombia, for example, I've looked at their process. I think it took about seven years and about 13,000 people taking part before there was total national acceptance. And once they made that decision, everything just flew. And I think that we're too fast and we don't consult enough. Comment, please.
Yeah, I think consultation is very important, but I also think we have, to some extent, a paralysis, a kind of consultation paralysis. So we get into a cycle where we don't actually make some concrete steps forward. So it is important from a consultation point of view, but I think there's a lot that can already be started by private sector entities coming forward and saying to the government, well, we can do this for you. At the moment, everybody's keeping their own thing that says, bring us the money and we'll do it, no problem. And we'll, each one does that. But I think there's still space for private sector entities to get together and go to government and say, well, why don't we do something like that and get some of those things started. I agree, it's absolutely important to go through a consultative phase, but we are to get 12 government departments to each cough up a bit of cash, one part paying for the e-health, one part paying for the training, one part paying for the e-government, those kind of things. I think that's going to take forever and a day. There's ways to fast track that by maybe incentivizing on tax breaks rather than actually trying to get cash out of each of these departments. And if we wait for cash to come out of all the departments, I think we're going to be waiting for a long time.